Welcome. The difference between optimal training and maximal training. And until someone actually hears the word optimal, I think it's almost a habit in Kyokushin to think that the only training is maximal training.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair call?
Yes, it's the default, not just in Kyokushin, but in pretty much everything, because we're told all through our lives, do your best, try your hardest, and all those types of things, which I agree with. But when it comes to the body physiologically and recovering and adapting and so on, if you go maximal all the time and everything, it's going to be a pretty short burn.
Exactly. I think a good illustration, for example, is Kumite. I remember when I was still fighting tournaments, there were some guys from down in the southern states who I knew were very, very strong fighters. And when I'd see them in tournaments, they just looked like killers. And so obviously I'm very wary of them. And more than once I get to a tournament, and either by the time I was due to fight them in the tournament, their body was broken, and so they had to withdraw, or they withdraw completely from the tournament before the tournament starts.
Really?
And I would look into it and ask, and it turns out that their dojo only knew one style of kumite, and that was maximal. And so invariably guys would get injured. And they had the potential to be multiple Australian champions, but they never were there because they just weren't present at the time. On the other hand, when I started when you were training Uchideshi, and when I had students such as Wally and Gary and so on, they were so good. Guys used to say, you must do a lot of kumite, a lot of hard kumite. Well, we didn't. You remember, we did a lot of kumite, but not hard kumite.
Not always, yeah.
We do a lot of drill kumite, a lot of touch speed kumite. I worked out many years ago, I think I worked out there's something like 16 or 17 properties that you need to be a good tournament fighter. And only 2 or 3 of them really required hard kumite. The rest you could do as drills. So this is a dilemma, I think, that people are constantly faced with, knowing how to tell the difference between training that is optimal and training that is maximal. And the other thing too, you must see it all the time, because I've seen it, where people think if you're not training to the max, you're not training at all. Is that a fair call? The guys think that?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, training plus recovery equals an optimal training effect. If you just focus on training all the time, that's a good thing, but you need the recovery side of it to get the optimal super compensation we've talked about before.
Can you say that again? Because I think that's really, really important. So training plus recovery
equals the optimal training effect. That's something that Ian King raised in one of his books many years ago, and I think it's so true.
Ian King, by the way, we have heard me mention Ian multiple times. I went to the same boarding school as Ian. I was a few years above him. I was in his brother's year, and then we ended up at the same university. Mitch has done his athletic preparation training with Ian King. For those who don't know Ian King, look him up, King Sports International. There's no exaggeration to say, and as Ian points out, there's probably not an athlete in the world today doing serious training who isn't in one way or another incorporating something that he has developed.
Yeah.
So he's very innovative, and that's very important to recognize. And I think when someone says something like training plus recovery equals the optimal training effect, most people think training equals
the training
effect. But the fact of the matter is, it's like a baby. You feed that baby, you put them to sleep, they spend 20 hours a day sleeping, and when they just grow and grow and grow and grow. So you need both. You can't just feed them. They need the
rest and recuperation, because that's when your body adapts and grows and changes, and the mitochondria and the blood volume changes, and the hematocrit, the red blood cell count changes, and all those types of things. It is when we're actually sleeping and when we're resting. We get the technical benefit and the skills and all that kind of stuff, the stress obviously during training, and then the second half of it is where we get the adaptation to training.
Nice. Another way that you can look at the difference between optimal and maximal is kumite.
Yes.
You know, there's always someone in the dojo that just feels like the only type of kumite worth doing is maximal kumite. And 2 things happen. You or they get injured, and you hate them because no one wants to train with them. There's a difference between doing really hard kumite that is skill development. Would you?
Also, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And doing kumite where it's just you're a bully.
And that's one of the differences you always talk about in striking arts versus, say, something like jiu-jitsu, where in jiu-jitsu you can roll hard and you've got the tap.
Yes.
But in karate or kyokushin, you can't smash someone crazy hard in the head or legs because they won't be able to walk for a week.
Yeah. And I've seen this over the years too. There's, different groups of guys that I've worked with over the years, and sometimes they only know that one thing. And I can understand their sentiment. Their argument is, well, if you don't go that hard, you'll never really know. It's like we were just talking about before. There's a time and place for maximal as well as optimal. And if you don't at some stage experience that maximal effort where you have to dig deep and pull it out and put up with, then when it happens in a real event, you're shocked. Your body shuts down. You can't handle it. So we're not saying that maximal is wrong. We're saying there's a time and place for it. And generally speaking, when you're talking about skill development, optimal
is where you want to go.
Mitch was saying before, you were saying that probably most of your training time when you're working with athletes is spent in this area.
Yeah, it really is because people that work with someone, physical coaches, they're very motivated and want to do better. So one of the initial thoughts is, I've got to go harder and do more and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes that is the case, but it's on certain things that they need. It's not just everything broadband. You just got to go harder and do more and everything. A lot of the times they need to improve their flexibility significantly, drop their connective tissue tension significantly, improve an aspect of their postural strength and so on. From a skills point of view, they might need to focus on whatever it happens to be, if they're depending on the sport or activity they're doing, there'll be one or two things that we really work on and drill those things and then maintain the rest. So it's optimizing their training. It's not so much just maximizing their training, because that doesn't require, there's times, like you said, for that in a peaking program, there'll be a short phase there where there is maximum intensity for whatever they're doing, depending on the sport and their training age and so on. But it's a blending to optimize things is really what you want.
One way I look at it, when we talked about Kihon in the past, or what is Kihon? Well, to me, Kihon is everything that you do that is not the actual event that you're training for. Well, in a way, optimal or maximal can be also seen like that, is that generally speaking, your training should be designed to optimize skill development, optimize somatic development, and the maximal effort usually can be saved for the event itself.
That's right. Yeah. 100%. And that's the thing with Ian talks about specificity versus transfer. And that's why I love what you say, that the Kihon, everything outside of the actual fight is Kihon. It's kind of like that in training as well. Everything outside of the actual event is non-specific. So you want it to transfer to the event, because even if you do the event, even jiu-jitsu as an example, like you rolled today, but it's not competition in front of a crowd, in front of where actual matches there, people are watching. That's an aspect of preparation that does exist, even though the technical thing you're doing is at a certain intensity. There's still that aspect as well that makes it non-specific when push comes to shove. But that's one of the rare sports where you can be very, very close to what you're doing, whereas a game of rugby league or a Kyokushin event or something like that, you're probably not going to go maximally like tournament style.
And speaking of jiu-jitsu or grappling arts, if you like, there's a certain level of application of a technique where you've got the position, you've got it, and everyone knows you, and they tap. But some guys just refuse to tap. So it's almost like they force you to keep going maximally. Well, you have to make a decision. Am I going to keep going maximally and risk injury? Or do I know that I have the position, have the technique? It's just a matter of applying more and more strength, and I'll get it anyway. So that's when you've got to, you said before that maximal effort it should be saved until you really, really need it. But some guys confuse really, really needing it for winning that round of kumite or winning that roll or things like that. And that's an area I think people need to keep in mind.
I think there's a good saying around that. You can win you don't have to win every battle, but you have to win the war kind of thing. And that's probably what you're referring to there.
So that, I think that point that you made, that maximal is saving it until you really, really need it, that's a good thing. And that takes it out of the realm of training. And in actual fact, that means you could probably argue the times in training where you really, really do go maximal are quite limited. Would you say?
Absolutely, and they have to be, because if you could go maximal and everything, you're not truly going maximal.
Yes.
It's like the Tabata thing you talk about.
Yeah.
You can only do X amount of them. If you're doing more, I'm sorry, you're not going maximal.
Yeah.
You're going maximally at a sub-maximal level.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
You know, and I've often paraphrased Ian King, Mitch's teacher, Ian King. To me, it's probably one of the most profound commentaries on training that I've heard for a long, long time. And Ian King says, train today so that tomorrow's training can be the best it can be. Train today so that tomorrow's training can be the best it can be. That is quite profound, because it means you don't want to train too easy, because that's also detrimental to your effort tomorrow. You don't want to train too hard. You want to find the right balance today so that you can go to training tomorrow having optimally benefited from today's training.
And if I could just expand on that, Shian, it's so true. And think about the sessions that you do today. If you train once a day or twice a day or three, whatever it happens to be, you want these sessions to improve you specifically as a Kyokushin practitioner or martial artist that we're talking about here tomorrow. So that means you're better tactically, you're better technically, you're better psychologically, or you're better physically. And even if you're not better physically all the time, because sometimes you will be sore, you will be fatigued, your glycogen stores are depleted.
You've got that dip before
that's
the
right.
super compensation.
But you've learned something technically that you can work on. You've learned something tactically that you've worked on. You've figured out something psychologically that has been improved. And this is this constant, never-ending improvement, stair-stepping your way to being a better martial artist all the time, consistently.
Yes, and not only work something out psychologically, but the endorphins are flying. You've trained really, really well. You're not injured. You walk out happy. You walk out hungry for more. You're not fatigued mentally, and you know that you've picked up nuances or tweaks in skill that you know tomorrow will make a difference. I think psychologically that's so important. If every training session you do is so exhausting that you don't want to go to training tomorrow, well, then you're completely missing the point.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. So that's that. Train today so tomorrow is your best session ever. That incremental process, and I think you've done an amazing job of that, Shian. After 50 years of training, that's 5 decades. I mean, it's incredible, and you're still improving and getting better. And all, just
so you're saying that I wasn't that good 10 years ago?
I didn't say that. I think you're amazing 10 years ago, but more amazing now.
Yeah, look,
but it really is. It's an amazing thing just to have seen.
Yeah, well, it's so exciting to know there's so much to learn out there, and there are so many good people who can help, learn. I just think you just get hungrier and hungrier for it. So that's a good thing. Another way to approach it too is there's the old saying which dates back, and I've written about it in my new book. It dates back to the Roman era, which was made popular in The Shooter with Mark Wahlberg, because he was the guy in The Shooter.
Yeah.
And he said, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I think that's really, really interesting, because if, for example, you're working punch skills, and every single punch you throw, you're trying to throw maximally, you have no opportunity to improve skills on a very fine detail level. So rhythm, it's like when you learn a guitar, you go ding and then ding, and and then before you know it, you're doing this. So you have to learn the rhythm, develop the rhythm, create the rhythm, and then maintain that rhythm as you increase. So that's when they say slow is smooth, smooth is fast. The smoothness is the rhythm, and you can only get that by training optimally all the time. Yeah, I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
Do you think it's our own ego that makes us try to train too hard? Yeah, I think that's a big, big factor, Vic. I think, and different environments and different schools will create that. If the school you train at encourages this endless need to win at all costs, well, then I think it's not just your ego, it's also the way you're being taught. But if the school you're at actually encourages people to work together constructively and optimize each other's skill development, well, then I think that's much, much better. But in terms of the ego too, Vic, I tend to find that it's a defensive mechanism, survival instinct, the strongest instinct, man, self-preservation. So you've got to fight that instinctive drive as well. And that, in a way, it's not just the ego. People think, it's the ego that, well, no, there's a deep-seated need to survive, which pushes the thought processes out of the frontal lobes into the amygdala and so on. So I call that the A game versus the A mindset. So the A game is when you feel like you need to survive, and that's what happens when the Kumite is maximal all the time. Whereas the A mindset is the creative mind, which allows you to develop skills in an optimal way, and I think that's very important. But yeah, the ego gets in the way, and I know there's always things, leave your ego at the door. Whenever I see leave your ego at the door, you can bet your bottom dollar that dojo's full of egos, because to write that up there like that it means there's been some problems in that dojo with the ego. I think that's pretty important. And I think too, we'll probably talk more about it next week, but we need to understand the difference between maximal intensity, or really even high intensity, versus technical quality. And I'll give you an illustration of that. You can be working a particular skill, and it gets to the point where in your head you feel you have to absolutely push out 50 reps of this skill. And it's quite an intricate skill. There's 7 or 8 steps in it, and each one requires you to, after 20, you're exhausted. After 21, you go, oh man, if your training requires that you push out 50 of them, well then, like Mitchell always likes to say, what are you actually training?
Well, if you've got 50 and you do 20 good ones and 30 not so good ones, you're rehearsing something you don't want.
Yes, you're rehearsing a skill in a way you don't want it. So that's why it's really important that you recognize that there's a line that's not healthy to cross. And that's the difference between maximal intensity, where you constantly push that intensity all the time, versus the need for technical quality.
And that's something that Vicky just mentioned there. Do you think, and that's where our ego gets in the way sometimes, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters, so when I'm coaching with athletes, is that they're a better athlete. Are they better at doing that? And I don't care if it took them 1 go or 1,000 goes. It's all irrelevant, because that's taking out. It's just what is executed now. What can you do now at the rate that's required, at the quality that's required? And that's sort of a different way to look at things.
Yes.
I just wanted to touch on some somatics, physical qualities, if that's okay.
Yep. So if you're not sure what somatics are, if you look it up in the dictionary, somatics literally refers to the physical qualities of the body, and we normally refer to 4 of them, right?
Yeah, flexibility, strength, speed, and endurance. And Xian's added a 5th, which is sturdiness, the ability to take impact.
I think it's very important for impact sports.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge thing. So when it comes to this maximal versus optimal, when it comes to flexibility, with muscle length, for example, if a muscle's too short, you're going to have joint issues, you're going to have muscle function issues and get injured. And if a muscle's far too long, you're going to get injured, right?
What do you mean by too long? So that weakens the joints, does it?
Well, if there's too much stress, the muscle will literally tear, right, as an example. But this is my proviso here. Most people's flexibility is so poor that
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. You need more length. Like 90% of people watching this, with all respect, need more muscle length, connective tissue length.
I've actually met one person ever in my life whose muscles were too long. And she was a ballet dancer in a group of ballet dancers at my dojo that used to train when I was at the YMCA.
Oh, yeah.
She was actually, to their credit, because we're talking about 1980s, she was actually given a completely different training program.
And as she should, because there's a joint control issue there. It's controlling the joint at extreme ranges, which is a secondary thing. So there's a thing called the Frank-Starling mechanism. Muscle too short, unhappy, muscle too long.
How do I write that?
Frank-Starling mechanism, I think it's called. It's to do with heart, but it's the same, applies to all connective tissues, I believe. So there's an appropriate area under the bell curve, but for the majority of people, they need more, because as we get older and train more, connective tissue becomes shorter and tighter and more dehydrated, and we need to reverse that. When it comes to strength, I want your side of this too. In maximal strength in training, you see a lot of people, they want to get big and strong, which is great. I'm not against it at all. I think it's really important, but there's a point of diminishing returns. And when it comes to something like Kyokushin or boxing or any striking art, there's a concept of rate of force development when it comes to strength. So the rate at which you can develop force becomes more important, especially if we're standing here at Kumite, than your actual maximal strength. And an example for that is maximal strength takes maybe 2, 3, 4 seconds to develop to get maximal strength if we're talking bench press, just as an example. Whereas rate of force development, throwing a medicine ball hard, throwing a yakuski into a bag or into pads or into someone's stomach, that doesn't take 2 to 4 seconds. That takes 0.2 to 0.4 seconds as an example. And so the person with a greater rate of force development, in addition to the technical, tactical skills, be able to hold a fist, as you talked about last week, Shion, is so much more important. And a great example of that, I think, is Wally Schnellbelt. Wally, I trained a little bit with Wally. I never saw him in the gym, but he was 5, 6, 7 times Australian heavyweight Kyokushin champion.
British Commonwealth champion, Canadian champion, 3rd in Brazil, 1st in Wales, 2nd in Russia, 1st in other words, he was
top 8 all Japan.
Yeah, top 8 all Japan.
Just scary man. And I was punched by Wally a number of times. Thankfully, I wasn't punched in a tournament or anything by him because I probably wouldn't be here. But I never saw him train in the gym. I saw him train in the dojo a lot. And his punch was notoriously extremely hard. I mean, there's people all over the world that know how hard Wally punched. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that or not, but just he had a reputation. But I'm sure that there was people in the World Tournament in 95 that had a bigger bench press than Wally, would be my guess.
We had guys in the dojo had a bigger bench press than Wally. Wally didn't care about bench presses.
Yeah.
He just wanted to know if he could knock you out with one punch.
And that's a great example of rate of force development. People often focus on the wrong qualities, where someone like Wally Schnellbelt focused on the appropriate qualities to develop that. And you mentioned something when we talked about this earlier in the board breaking for the tournament.
Well, I mean, as you know, in the World Tournament, to separate certain fights, sometimes fights are so close they can't separate them. So they'll go to the differential in weight. Remember, the World Tournament, there was no weight division, so you can be 70 kilograms fighting someone 120 kilograms. And obviously, if you take them to 3 or 4 extensions, well, that's a fair call. You've given away 50 Ks and they still can't put you away, so you get the decision. Another area that they use is the board breaking. So you do a series of breaks. Now, board breaking arguably is a combination of kinetic energy and gravity. If you know how to use your body weight well, you can optimize your body weight with speed. That gives you kinetic energy. And Wally was by no means the biggest, strongest guy in the tournament, but he did win the board breaking award at the Worlds, and he equaled the world record at the time. And that's a really good, clear example of someone whose punching skills were way beyond a measurement of his maximal physical
capacity. Yeah, because it's so limited.
Yes.
And I just think Wally's example is just incredible because it's technique, distance, angle, timing, rhythm, all those things.
Yes.
In addition to rate of force development, holding the fist well.
Yeah, and then you can even take that to Gary, who was a lightweight at 70 kilograms. The average weight of the guys he was fighting in the Worlds was actually 91 kilograms. And there's that too. And another area too, that sometimes you roll with when you're rolling, if you're doing BJJ, you're rolling with very, very heavy people. But still, it doesn't faze you because they don't know how to optimize their weight. And optimizing your weight when you're on top is all about being able to focus your body weight on a very, very small area. So sometimes you'll have someone who's 70, 75, 80 kilograms. They're on top of you. You go, my gosh, they feel so heavy. They feel like they're 120, 130 Ks. Whereas someone who's 120, 30 Ks, quite often they don't even feel like they're 50, 60 Ks because they don't know how to optimize their weight. So that's another really clear example using gravity and technique as to show you the difference between what is optimal and what is maximal. Yeah, I think that's really important.
So that's a summary of when it comes to the strength side of things. The speed side of things and the physical qualities as well is, she and I might be trained together and I may be younger, just in this example, and physiologically faster.
Not as good looking, but
definitely not. But he has better technical and tactical competencies in karate, jiu-jitsu, everything that we do. So he's able to nullify any perceived speed advantage I have through other means. And this is a really important thing. And that's what Sian said earlier, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. That's a big time thing when it comes to speed development and speed training.
So speed is not velocity. Maybe that's a difference. Velocity is just raw straight line speed.
Yes.
But speed involves
in a skill-based activity that
yes.
martial arts is.
Yes.
It's a completely different thing. You can
Yes.
have Usain Bolt or whoever, and he's the fastest man on the planet, world record 100 meters in that example. But I guarantee you put him in a Kyokushin match with someone, you put him in a jiu-jitsu mat, he's not the fastest guy there, guaranteed, because there's a skill element. And this is where people miss the soul training physiologically versus the integration of
yes.
technical, tactical, physical, psychological.
Yes.
Big errors are made here in training.
And one way I look at that is recognizing that skill development should be based on rhythm before it's based on speed. Because as you learn a guitar, as you learn any musical instrument, as you learn a skill, it's much more important that you go step by step with the right rhythm than it is to go step by step too fast. The difference between rhythm, which is technically accurate applied speed and timing is that the rhythm is within you. The rhythm is all about coordinating all your weapons, all your movement as one, whereas timing is that rhythm when someone else is involved. So your rhythm is within yourself. Your timing is in connection to your training partner. And when you say you can have the fastest man in the world rolling, everyone's rolled with someone who it almost seems like they're just asleep. It almost seems like it's uncanny. It's just that they're one step ahead of you. You're going, blah, blah, blah. You're like Taz, like this, and they just put their hand there, and that stops everything you did. Or you're used to doing a certain thing, and as you do that, they just put their arm in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And it seems almost superhuman, but it's not. It's just technical superiority. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's an example of that. Is
speed. Is there any footage of Wally available? I'll have a look. There must be something around somewhere.
Speed is acceleration. So Anthony, acceleration is a subquality of speed. So there's certain subqualities of speed. Detection and reaction to stimulus, auditory, visual, kinesthetic is the first. Next is agility.
So say that again. Auditory, visual, and kinesthetic are the three ways that you can detect stimuli.
Yes.
Correct?
That's the first instance of speed training, because a person that can, like Xian said, if you can identify something quickly, you can stop it quickly, which appears to make you fast.
Yes.
But reality, it's a superior technical superiority. Yes. The next is...
and I can't overemphasize how important that is in the martial arts, because when you train the martial arts for 50, 60, 70 years, that's what you're doing. You're purifying and perfecting that timing.
Look what Sensei Mike Clark just said. Yes, I've often seen you've seen speed and power get in the way of people developing skill. Exactly what you just said.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. And I can remember many years ago, Nakakura Sensei was when the Brisbane Kendo Club, shout out to everybody at the Kendo Club, used to train in the same dojo as I did. And they were visited by Nakakura Sensei. I think he was 70 years old at the time. He was a 10th degree in Kendo, which is incredibly rare. And he was doing randori, sparring in Kendo with the bamboo sticks. He was doing it with current Australian Open champions, and they couldn't touch him. And he just go... And his timing was sublime to the point where it almost seems like he's this old man asleep, but no one could touch him. Isn't that uncanny? And that's the mastery. And like Mike says, speed and power often get in the way of developing skill. It's a perfect example, I can remember once I was doing a seminar with John Donoghue. I did the stand-up, he did the grappling. John Donoghue was my coach from white belt to brown belt in BJJ. And one of the people at the seminar was a really nice guy, but he was Australia's strongest man. He used to compete in those strongman contests. At one stage, he won the world title and everything. I mean, the guy could easily bench press 5 times my body weight. And John's explaining the concept of pinpoint accuracy with pressure on top. And the guy said, yeah, but, you know, if you're strong enough underneath, could you just kind of push them off? And John said, all right, this went on. This was a dialogue that went backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times. And John could finally see that the guy, even though the guy wasn't being rude, but
he's just curious.
He wasn't going to let the point go, because this is the strongest man in the world. I mean, he could bench press 300 Ks. He looks at John's 90 Ks. You know, he goes, well, I can bench press you 3 times over. So John goes, well, it's actually got nothing to do with it. Yeah. And what John did is he put him in side control, and he's chatting to everyone. And he's chatting to people, saying, anytime you want, you can get out. And he's chatting to people. And this guy, after about 15 seconds, tapped out. Says, yeah, no, I get it. So once again, there's a perfect example of the difference between optimal leverage and maximal leverage. Maximal leverage didn't work because optimal leverage trumped it.
And it comes to the concept of transfer as well. He developed his strengths at such specific joint angles and so on that when he was put in a different position, it doesn't transfer.
Yes.
It does not transfer. And that's the big thing that people don't realize, that's such a wonderful example of.
We call that Archimedes over Newton, where, for example, uchiuke at a certain angle is completely useless. You change that angle by 15 degrees, and it's one of the most powerful techniques. People often say to me, why do we do so many uchiuke? And I've often, I've said before that once I had far too much time on my hands, so I counted all the techniques in Kyokushin kata, and the most common technique was middle punch. The second most common was uchiuke. But people were saying, yeah, but you never see it in fighting. Yeah, which fighting are you talking about? Tournament fighting, of course, because tournament fighting is not real. It's a sport. You have 4 corner judges and a referee, and if you fall down, they go stop the fight and help you up safely. The judges, the primary role of a referee is your safety. You take a referee away, the primary objective of your opponent is not your safety.
The opposite.
Yeah, it's the opposite. So certain techniques which you don't see in tournaments, you don't see them because they're not really practical in tournaments, but they're incredibly practical in a street fight. But that uchiuke at this angle is useless. At that angle is very powerful. So it's the same when you're grappling, when you're rolling. You have your arm at a certain angle, it becomes an almost impassable wall. You change that angle and it just collapses under pressure like that. So that's a good example as well.
Yeah, great examples.
If you've got any questions, the difference between maximal and optimal, please get on the chat. Whilst we're here, I'll also give a shout out. So, if you like what you see, pass the word around, send a link to your friends. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. I'm trying to get to 1 million, so I've only got 998,000 to go. But anyway, make sure that you subscribe, hit the bell. To my Patreon supporters, you have no idea what it means to me, and thank you very much.
Sorry, Anthony, I'll go back to that. So subqualities of speed, detection and reaction to stimulus, which is auditory, kinesthetic, and visual, depending on the sport and activity. These are generic things that we apply to all sports, not just martial arts. I learned from Ian. Next is agility and coordination. So the ability to move our body in a coordinated, agile way, whatever that happens to be. And that's all different in all different activities and sports.
And again, very sport specific.
Yes, incredibly, because a boxer will do a certain way, a rugby league player will be a certain way, a grappler will be a certain way, and so on. And then is acceleration that you mentioned earlier. That's the next subquality that we use, and the short and long acceleration. Some sports are short acceleration, some are longer. And we want to draw out the acceleration phase and say running sports, because a longer accelerating for means we're going to end up faster. As soon as we stop accelerating, we're at the 4th subquality, which is max velocity. And once you're at max velocity, you're not going any faster. That's as fast as you're going. And then there's speed endurance, and there's different types of speed endurance as well, intermittent, repetitive, and continual speed endurance. So they're all broken down into different sub-qualities. These are the ones that we use with Ian and KSI, and we apply them to different athletes in different sports at different times. But the most important ones here, specifically that we're talking about for, say, Kyokushin and striking, is definitely the detection and reaction to stimuli, the agility and the coordination, because it's such a technical thing, the punch and different shituski and oiski and all of them. And the acceleration, the rate of force development is very important, because sometimes you're punching from a distance, that lunging long gyakuski that I think that I learned from everyone in the Brisbane dojo. And then there's punching in close, that's a different range as well, which is very important. Gary had that incredible, he'd go over, under, over with a one hand, and it was just boom, boom, boom. It was just incredible agility and coordination, acceleration.
And that all of those, we're talking about somatics, and that doesn't even talk about the technical input. So none of that matters in a tournament without the technical know-how and ability to make them apply. So when you talk about, for example, the long reverse punch and so on, well, the technical ability to do that well is what reduces the resistance to allow the acceleration to occur and to get optimal outcome.
Using the stretch shortening cycle and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I love what Ian's done with the physical qualities, these sub-qualities, is they're integrated into auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. Because in a 100-meter sprint, it's an auditory cue you're reacting to. It's the starter's gun going bang. So you've got to be good at that. In Kyokushin, for example, you might be reacting to something visual because you're watching them. And sometimes if they catch you off guard, you're reacting to something kinesthetic all of a sudden. So it's a little bit different as well. Could be auditory if you hear them breathing or something like that before they do something. So it's all very intertwined with the actual sport that you're doing. And then the agility and coordination. As a physical preparation coach, I have some drills for that, but most of it comes from a martial arts instructor. It comes from the head coach. It comes from the skills coaches that we integrate. And that's why integration of training is very important. You can't just have, do your training and do this weird stuff outside of training. It's got to integrate and connect well, in my view.
So to sum up, Mitch, we're talking about the difference between optimal training, maximal training, and why maximal training has its place, but generally speaking is probably, I almost hate to say it, but it's probably the enemy of good skill development.
In the early stages of development, for sure.
Yeah. And
has that been your experience?
Yeah. It's always been the case when you get someone who feels like everything has to be done maximally. It creates a problem for everyone else in the dojo. It creates a big problem for them because they use too much of their body. So in actual fact, skill development is quite often learning how to shut down more and more of your body so that you can refine and refine and refine.
That's a great point. And just to wrap up on that, fitness, something Ian talks about, his view on it and mine is too, is all about efficiency. It's sort of what you were just saying then, shutting down different parts of the body and just using a single thing. And that's becoming very efficient in our movements, which I think is key.
Yeah.
Or smart, Marco, yes, like being a detective of their clues.
Cues. Sorry, yeah, exactly. That's a fair call. And the better the detective is, to use your metaphor, the better the detective is, the sharper they are at picking up those cues. And so, for example, when you're rolling, you roll with a white belt versus a blue, purple, brown, black, high-level black. Their detective skills just get better and better and better. So you can do exactly the same flow and technique, and it becomes more and more difficult as their ability to perceive your cues improves. And it will get to the point where that skill just won't work anymore against certain people because they're so tuned in, because of their training, they're so tuned into your cues, you can't even
do that anymore.
Yeah, I'm just using your metaphor there, Marco. That's a good call. So Yes, there's a time and place for Maximal. Unfortunately, in Kyokushin, we probably think that every day is a time and place for Maximal. That's not the case. The primary outcomes of constantly training maximally is injury, mental fatigue, that sort of thing.
Injury, yeah, burnout.
Burnout, yeah. Ideally, you want to look for optimal training, and that also means the ability to recognize when it's time to stop. That's the biggest thing. If you set yourself a goal, I'm going to do 1,000 of these today, and you keep going well past the point where you should, then you're no longer training optimally. You're now training in a way that is far from optimal. It's actually you're creating drawbacks in your skill development. So anyway, there you have it. We'll wind it up there, I think. That was very interesting. It's always great to have Mitch here. He answers all those scientific questions. If you ask me what are the sub qualities of strength, I would not have the speed. I wouldn't have picked up things like detection and reaction to stimuli and so on like that. Thanks, everybody. Really, really interesting. Good to see you, Vin. Hope all's well in your home territory. Rochelle from Canada. Greg, how are you? Skill development slowing down. That speaks a lot of the sports training. That is something we all should do. Yes. Skill development is more important than anything else in sport, because if you look at the champions of any sport, they're champions because they're very skillful.
Absolutely.
The world's full of very physically gifted people who can't apply skills.
And I'm a physical preparation coach, and I say all the time, de-emphasize this, focus on skills all the time. It's a big, big opportunity for athletes.
Yeah. So thank you, guys. Appreciate that. Thanks for the comments. Sensei Mike, good to have you. Vic, nice to see you. Vic and I just trained with Mitch as well at the BJJ school. Frederick, thanks. Good to see you. Paul, good to see you. Daniel, thank you very much. Anth, one day can you do a session on anticipation training? Okay, I could do that. I could sum that up in one sentence, but I won't. Just to make you come back. I will literally sum that up in one sentence, Anth. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, look, we'll be back next week. We're continuing this science series with the connecting of the science and the art, and blend them together. It was Rob. Nice to see you. Rob Wall and I have been training for nearly 50 years together. Good. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Mitch.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks for training. Mitch and I trained together as well, along with Vicky there. We'll see you next week. Hope you enjoy that. Hope you got something out of it. Us.